You know what's odd? I've been trying to make decent YouTube videos on this channel for about 4.5 years now, and not only have I yet to succeed, but I haven't even covered a JRPG, which is what I originally wanted to focus on for content, along with just random PS2 games. Sure, there are those really short response videos about Octopath Traveler updates and the summaries of Valkyria Chronicles and the first Disgaea, but I don't count those. JRPGs are my favorite genre, but I haven't had the time to play and review them in recent years, although I certainly had the money to buy a bunch of them. So I guess it's time I start going through my backlog and tell you about a whole bunch of weird stuff you might not know about. Imagine, if you will, opening the pages of a storybook, its contents filled with the promise of classic adventure and fantasy. You know nothing beyond what was shown on the cover, and you go in expecting the kinds of stories you'd tell a child before bed. A story of brave heroes, fierce monsters, and a globe-spanning odyssey to save the people. That's basically what it feels like to pop in the disc to Guardians Crusade, a late PS1 JRPG developed by Tamsoft and published by Activision. Which, if you know anything about those two names, sounds incredibly odd. We all know about Activision, they're basically a fantasy villain in their own way, so it's rather odd seeing their names attached to a project like this. But if you know Tamsoft, this seems even more bizarre. To keep with the storybook analogy, it would be like the person who wrote that storybook just did so the one time and then went on to make trashy comic books and borderline hentai. The company is known nowadays for making series like Senran Kagura and One Chambara, among other similar titles, but this is a much different project. Guardians Crusade, known as Knight and Baby in Japan, is a kid-friendly JRPG that was meant to serve as an introduction to the genre for younger players, while still being engaging enough for all ages. Something along the lines of Pokemon, but, you know, not awful. It was released in 1999, and while it apparently received good reviews in both East and West, even earning an 8.5 from IGN, it seems to have faded into obscurity. I'd never even heard of the game before I found it at a used game store a few years ago, and while I have found a few videos covering the game, it's clear this title doesn't have that much of a following online for some reason. So let's pop this into my trusty old PS2 and see what we might be missing out on. It starts out with one of those lovely CG intros, which reminds me of something my elementary school music teacher would show the class on the last days of the semester, giving us a look at key events that will happen over the course of the adventure, set to weirdly epic guitar music. We get to the title screen and it's not very impressive. I think they just used this for the box art. It looks exactly the same. Also, this is just not very impressive at all. On the right side, there are quite a few gameplay options, which I don't see much on PS1 games, so that's pretty cool. Soon as I start up the game, part of the intro movie happens again with a stork carrying something during a storm while being chased by monsters. Then we cut to our hero doing what all heroes do at the start of JRPGs, sleeping. You know, I almost want to keep a running tally of how many times games start like this as I cover them. Our little fairy friend Nahani tries to wake him up, and we get to name him. By default, his name is Knight, but let's call him Finn. The mayor wants us to go check in on a nearby town, so we go do just that, and when we walk back, we find a strange pink monster in the middle of the path. And even when I try to walk past it, God himself comes down from the heavens. I think it's God anyway, I'm pretty sure. And tells us to bring this little baby dragon to its mother at God's tower or darkness will befall the land. So that's your story. You're tasked with traveling to this tower with a baby dragon or something evil will happen. I'm sure this won't be any more complicated than that, nope. Following the Japanese title, its default name is Baby, but adventure time! Right off the bat, the mayor says, look, this is a weird little pig rabbit bubblegum thing and I don't like it, so go leave it at the Cave of Fear. I'm sure it'll be fine. So you go do that, realize it was a dumb idea, and go save the baby from a giant monster bird that chases you out of the cave and leaving you to fulfill your literal God-given task. That's how the story is presented for a while, just you going on a journey to this mysterious tower while something is going on you aren't entirely clear about. A very simple task that holds great significance for the world in some wholly unspecific way. And for a while, that's really all it is. I'm perfectly fine with that, since rather than using the opening hours to drown you in exposition or try to establish a bunch of mechanics. It gives you a simple goal and spends some time letting you experience its rather odd and charming world. For example, the town you're able to visit first after the Cave of Fear is Istin, where you meet a merchant called Bonnick who gets kidnapped, so some guy named Rickton can force you to fight in his place for the mayoral election. After asking the townspeople, it turns out they have a tradition where the candidates fight each other to decide who wins, but they're allowed to hire substitutes. Which I personally found pretty funny. Sounds about as effective as the American election system. This is also where you meet a boy named Darkbeat, who basically pops up as your pseudo-rival and self-proclaimed chosen one. That's the kind of story here, a silly adventure tale that almost feels like a Saturday morning anime or classic fairy tale. At the same time, it has all sorts of quirky charm and funny dialogue to flesh out the personality of the world, even if it does rely a lot on familiar story beats. You know, stuff like a sassy fairy companion, a group of trained older warriors on a similar quest to you, and a very shallow villain we'll get to later. You know, very basic elements, not really pushing the envelope, which is totally fine, seeing as it's meant to be an entry point for kids. Although that's not to say it's completely bare bones and lacking in teeth. It's a fun story that gets more compelling as it goes on, which is something I can't say for most media intended for children. I'm a proponent of the idea where just because something is primarily meant for a younger audience, it does not excuse it from putting in the effort to make it good. There are too many times where I've heard something, whether it be an anime, game, or movie, where people defend its poor quality by saying, oh, it's meant for kids. Are kids stupid? Yes, most definitely, but that does not mean they don't deserve good media. They can appreciate a good story, and saying low-quality ones are excusable because it's not meant for adults is why we keep getting new Pokemon games. Plus, be honest, if a kid's game had a good story, you wouldn't count that against it, so stop it with this lazy double standard. Guardians Crusade has a fairly solid story, and while it's very simple on the surface, you can learn a lot about the world by talking to NPCs. For example, there's this weird organization called the Artima Church that has buildings in most of the major towns you visit. At first, I didn't think anything of them. Big whoop, JRPGs are full of churches or monasteries or whatever. But then I start hearing about people going missing after entering the churches or interacting with the priest, and it suddenly feels a lot more sinister. I didn't expect an E-rated game to have an evil cult going on in the background, especially when it doesn't blatantly tell you it exists. I mean, you hear about the religion a few times on your journey, but it's never something that really requires your attention, and I think that's really interesting. You even learn some interesting things about Darkbeat, like how the strange yellow dragon accompanying him is actually his sister Ibki, who's been cursed by the villain of the story. Considering how harshly he beats you in Istin, he certainly establishes himself as someone more capable than you, but he seems like a pretty noble and trustworthy guy. After the little stop in Istin, you're told God's Tower is on the eastern continent, so you need to travel to the nearby Zed Harbor to board the ship. This is also where you meet Sir Calcanor, a respected knight of the kingdom, who acts pretty dismissive of you, even mistaking you as their bellhop or something. Like, geez dude, I'm on a mission from God himself, I don't need this baloney. The following sequence is pretty basic. You need a ticket to get on the ship, but they're out of tickets. Luckily, you hear about the mayor giving people free stuff for finding and defeating something called the Emerald Beast in the desert. I kid you not, it's because he wants the emerald because it's shiny. So now you go to fight it and get the ticket. It's a fine example of what I call a checklist quest, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially here where it feels like a reasonable extension of this segment of the game. The game does encourage you to explore your surroundings and even opens up quite a bit partway through the story, so if you're not a fan of linearity like this segment, the rest of the game isn't like it. You have good reason to explore, like talking to NPCs for funny dialogue or pointing you in the right direction. Some of them have some pretty funny scenarios, like this couple in Dinfrado where the husband is turned into a zombie, but the wife's totally okay with him being like that and serving him raw meat. That was pretty great. You can also find a few side quests in the game or locate treasure chests. There are plenty of chests scattered around the world holding things like healing items or new equipment, but the main thing to find is something called living toys, which are the main unique aspect of this game's combat. See, while the framework of the battle system is the standard turn-based JRPG affair, Knight doesn't actually unlock new abilities on his own like a lot of other games. You can't learn them from trainers or spend experience points or unlock them in a set order. All he can do by himself is attack, while all other actions are done by living toys found throughout the world. These little trinkets cover the rest of the abilities you'd expect, you know, some dish out damage, others heal, some give status ailments, usual stuff. Unlike other games though, where your abilities just happen once on command and that's it, Living toys are closer to summons. They're even divided up into 3 categories depending on how they work. If it has a little flash circle thing, it can only be used once per battle, so they tend to be pretty strong. The little swoosh arrow are like normal skills and can be used repeatedly. Then there are the ones with the whatever this symbol's supposed to be. They work like new party members, staying on the field and repeating an action every round until they take enough damage to be removed. This is honestly a really neat addition to the battle system, and I think it does a better job of introducing turn-based gameplay to a younger audience than something like Pokemon, which I've always found to be annoyingly restrictive. Wait for like 2 people watching this who are super into competitive Pokemon or whatever, comment, actually it's a very complex and in-depth battle system and you're just too stupid to... No. That's not how it goes, because as much as you want to debate this point, it doesn't matter how much time and effort you spend mapping out optimal stat curves in relation to personality types and whatnot. If your opponent is using a fire Pokemon, you're going to use water. That's just how it goes. Granted, a combat system implementing type weaknesses isn't inherently bad. Heck, Persona has it and it works just fine, as does Final Fantasy. It makes sense for something to be made of fire to be harmed more by water than wind, but at certain points it just feels like type weakness plays too much of a role in combat and really railroads your approach. In Guardians Crusade, you do still have vaguely elemental equipment and living toys, but it never really feels like you're relying on weaknesses to have an advantage. At the very least, I never noticed if enemies have weaknesses. Maybe they do inherently, or maybe it was the job of certain toys to give them some, because there are 2 that can do that for some reason. Although that might be due to the odd designs of the enemies not being clear with what they might be vulnerable to. I really do like the monster designs. They're pretty silly and fun for the most part. Like this weird lizard in the desert that falls apart for attacks, that's pretty funny. There's this living door called Doorface, that's just great. There's this one enemy called Octagoog, which... I mean, look at this thing. This does not look like it's in a kid-friendly RPG. It looks like it's from Yume Nikki or Kodelka. One day. Although one thing's for sure, they're all weak to contributor. As much praise as I have for the living toy system being a fun and interesting twist on acquiring new abilities, they also feel kind of unbalanced. See, there aren't really that many toys you want to use in combat, with some having just direct upgrades, and most ones you find don't really do much in combat. There are 70 toys in the game, but I think I only ever ended up using maybe 15 at most. It's really just because the ones I did use were the ones that just did flat out damage, and I found those a lot more useful than the quirkier ones. A lot of the others were about giving status ailments or buffs, and most of the wacky ones just didn't help at all. Like the one that commentates on the fights, I only used that once because activating a toy takes up some of your psychic points, this game's version of MP, and your whole turn. Spending a turn for a silly gag just doesn't seem worth it to me when I could just summon this one called Contributor and kill everything with the sheer power of capitalism. This thing is so broken, it pretty much became my main toy throughout the adventure. When I first got it, it was dealing between 70 to 120 damage per round, but by the end it was dishing out anywhere from the low 200s to nearly 300. Why is this thing so strong? It's an egg throwing coins at people. It also doesn't help how a lot of the pure attackers aren't found until later in the game, so my options for just dealing damage were a bit limited for most of my playthrough, and using Contributor just made sense. Especially since it only used 5 psychic points per activation. Sure, it cost 20 rubies, the game's currency, every attack, but the amount of money I was given in battle makes that feel like pocket change before long. By the time I got more attackers, I just didn't find any point in the wackier ones. One of my favorites is this one called Mini Car, which has a small chance of just randomly knocking out an enemy every turn. Like, it only happened once, but it was really funny to see. Late in the game, there's one called Sumode, which can randomly knock out any number in a group of enemies, but it's single use, and I never saw the need to use it when the chance of it working was so low, and I just had better guarantees of damage. The status ailment ones are interesting though, with something like Freud, yes, that's its name, putting any opponent to sleep, but again, why would I put it to sleep when I can just summon Contributor and win in like 2 to 3 turns? There's also Timeout, which prevents all damage to everyone for 3 turns. I think I used it like once during a boss fight, and I don't think I ever needed it again. Admittedly, I didn't explore a lot of their uses in combat, but my little samurai egg was just throwing coins, taking out half the enemy's health every round, so I'd say I got by just fine. I kind of wish I did utilize the status effects more, since they can be absolutely devastating if used correctly. Paralysis was a big pain against some enemies, and I remember this one dragon in Nord Temple who stun-locked me by sealing me in ice, which, yeah, I won't lie, that felt pretty cheap. It was one of the few times I died in the game, although 2 of those times were because my own living toy hurt everyone in combat instead of just the enemy. Really late in the game, I found some toys at Castle Ryan that inflicted status ailments to everyone, and I never even tried using them because why would I want to inflict such debilitating conditions on myself? That just seems really pointless. I definitely feel like they needed to spread out the practicality a bit more, especially with how annoying some of these are to find. Locating them in dungeons or towns is fine, you just have to look around for treasure chests, and some you get from NPCs. That makes sense. But then there are the ones that really go beyond encouraging you to explore and into, yeah, just call the helpline in the CD case. Off the top of my head, there are some you can get in part 4, no story spoilers here. At this point, you're on the game's final big mission, and you need to travel around the world before taking on the final boss. But there are 2 toys you can get in Carmarthen. You get Voodoo Doll from the miner and Avalanche from the old man in the nearby cave. The problem for me is these locations are nowhere near the places you need to visit, so literally the only reason to come back for these is the toys themselves, and you have no way of knowing these exist unless you're extremely thorough or look up a guide. I did the latter for my playthrough, and I'll link it in the description below if you'd like to play this while picking up all the living toys or have some more information the game doesn't tell you. That's something I'm really mixed about when it comes to this game, the general lack of information at points. The biggest example I can think of is the start of part 3, where you fall off the boat and rescue Baby from these purple people called Kerplians who are about to sacrifice him to their evil god Uganga by going and defeating their deity. They give you a magic whistle to summon Chester the giant water bug, which functions as the boat for the game.
Everybody got that?
Normally, you can ask Nahani where you're supposed to visit next, but asking her here just has her say, "Let's go explore the world." Personally, I'm not a big fan of this section. I get what they're trying to do, give you a way to travel the entire world, and I must say, I admire how they just give you so much freedom in this section, but yeah, I just don't like its structure. It isn't that I outright hate exploration gameplay, or even this part is poorly done. I just don't enjoy it when a linear storyline suddenly shifts into this more open and wandering design. Like, if you enjoy this kind of given freedom in exploring the world, I totally understand. I just don't share that preference. Maybe that's why I don't like Metroidvanias very much. There's just something about this aimless structure that bugs me in games. Like, I'm supposed to be somewhere important, and I can't figure out where it is, and it starts bothering me after a while, especially since despite being given the ability to explore the entire world, your next mandatory location is just a short way north from Kerpel. Just seems kinda pointless. Alright, I completely forgot to talk about Baby, your traveling companion. He's not just there to be escorted, he actually joins in battle, and he functions kind of like a virtual pet. So it's almost like Tamagotchi or Digimon. You can't give it equipment or give it direct commands, he pretty much just functions on his own, and I mean, he's alright. I didn't really get much out of him during my playthrough, I just let him do his own thing. His damage through the whole game is pretty low unless he's using one of the several transformations you find throughout the game, ranging from a boxing glove to a giant knife and even replicating some enemy monsters. How does he learn these? Flip if I know, he just kinda does it. According to the manual, he gains them by defeating enemies in combat and at certain points in the story, using them when he's angry or feeling loyal. Now how do you make him loyal? Food. There's a command in the menu to give him snacks, and I just thought that was a cute way of using items on him, even though you could use items through the inventory normally. Turns out it's actually a way to increase his loyalty so he doesn't attack you in battle, which, yeah, that happened to me a lot. I kept wondering why this happened, and the only place where I could find any info is near the back of the manual, and even then it's kind of vague. By the way, while I'm here, I just want to say this is a really boring manual. It's all in black and white, there aren't really any illustrations or special designs to fit the game. It's a big disappointment. But yeah, sorry to say I didn't really mess with the little baby dragon pig rabbit thing. I know it's a major element of the game, I don't know, I didn't take much interest in the mechanic during my playthrough. Overall, the combat is decently fun, which is great since it's pretty much all the dungeons are for. Much like Baby, I don't have much to say about the dungeons, but that's not due to me not exploring them mechanically in depth, it's just they don't have depth to explore in the first place. The dungeon structure in this game is basically just a few winding corridors and rooms filled with monsters, a few branching paths to find treasure, and then a boss fight. Unlike other JRPGs, they don't have any kind of unique aspect to set them apart from each other, like puzzles or unique exploration aspects. They're functional, but the only things really separating them from each other are the enemies you find in them and the visuals. And on that note, let's cover the presentation real quick, which I really like. Like I said earlier, the simplistic cartoony art style reminds me of this weird 3D animated music video compilation I saw as a kid, and I can understand why some critics at the time didn't find it that impressive for 1999. That year also saw titles like Final Fantasy VIII, Legend of Legaia, Jade Cocoon, and Grandia, with the following year bringing us great titles like Chrono Cross, Final Fantasy IX, and Legend of Dragoon. With those standards in mind, it's easy to see why Guardians Crusade didn't impress with its simple design, bright colors, and blocky environments. Although it is majorly impressive how there's no simplified overworld. Everything is just rendered in 3D at the same scale. It's pretty awesome. A technically impressive feat for the hardware for sure, especially when it's all on a single disc, but it's hard to be impressed when the best looking guy at the party is right next to it on the shelf. Still, I think it works well enough for the storybook feel they're going for. Giving it more detail would just make it come across as really odd considering the general tone of the game. The visuals make it feel very lighthearted and charming, great for a kid's game. If there's one thing that definitely impresses me about the presentation, it's the soundtrack. Like, it is legitimately great. Granted, this praise is coming from someone who doesn't know a lot about music, but there is one great thing I can say about it. The soundtrack is so good, there were times in my playthrough where I paused the video I had on in the background just to listen to it. That's not something I can say about a lot of video game soundtracks, but it made me pay attention to it, and that's high praise in and of itself. It also helps how it's a very odd soundtrack with all sorts of different genres and instruments. There are admittedly some tracks that feel like typical JRPG songs, but then you have ones that cover jazz, rock, some techno, and the main battle theme is this really cool piece of funk that's way more groovy than it needs to be. A lot of the songs can also give moments a real sense of intimidation or weight to what's happening, and the feelings of each song go a long way to make the story's presentation so enjoyable. Although for some reason the music for the Cave of Fear sounds not what you'd expect for something called the Cave of Fear. Sounds more like the Cave of Barry White. It's a good song, it's just really out of place. The only issue I have with it is how there's only one short song for the overworld and basic battles, and they just kind of get old after a while. Still, if that's the biggest complaint I have with the soundtrack, that's pretty small potatoes. Give it a listen sometime on YouTube. I'm honestly surprised I never hear about this game when it comes to great PS1 soundtracks. Okay, I think I've covered just about everything major, but there's one big segment of the game I really want to talk about. Everything I've said so far covers the story up to where you actually go to God's Tower at the start of Part 4, and there are some pretty big story beats from this point on, so if you don't want to hear the spoilers, skip to the time shown on screen now. I recommend you do so if you haven't already played the game, because it's a pretty neat story, but if you've already played it or just don't care, that's fine too. Still here? Alright, let's talk about God's Tower. So, we're given this baby dragon, travel across the lands, help decide an election, fall off a ship, beat a giant plant monster, and finally arrive at God's Tower. Once we get there, we see the game's villain, Carmine, being confronted by Calcanor and his party. Remember me bringing these guys up a while ago? Well, they've been popping up to collect these mysterious stones from 3 previous boss fights, all in an effort to stop Carmine. However, Gwynlydon, the wise old wizard of the party, reveals he's actually a servant of Carmine named Glor, and he lied to the others so he could give the stones to Carmine. But obviously, Glor is met with betrayal himself and has turned into some weird-looking zombie dragon thing so he can deal with Calcanor. Once the noble knight and his mage companion Ramel fall off, it's up to Knight to defeat it and chase after Carmine. On the way up, you encounter some ancient robots corrupted by Carmine, which actually end up being some pretty cool mini-boss fights. After fighting 2, we finally reach the top of God's Tower and... No, this is still rated E. Fun for all the family, go on a big adventure, befriend a cute little dragon, see their mother collapse in a pool of her own blood. Baby cries out for his mother and runs up to her, giving Carmine the chance to rip the stone out of him and toss his dying body towards night. Like, geez, this is pretty intense. Now that he has all 4 stones, Carmine reveals his grand scheme to use them and unleash an ancient creature of darkness named, oh geez, Zizan? Zizan? I'm gonna say Zizan, it sounds like the most evil pronunciation. He's a pretty vanilla villain, honestly, just kind of fitting with the rest of the game's general story. Wanting to take control of Zizan to rule the world, not really much to say about him, but he does reveal his first name is Artema, so all those churches seen in the game are actually his followers, and he's using the power of the stone to make all of them mutate just like Lord. That's pretty neat, actually. Darkbeat arrives to confront him in an attempt to turn his sister back to normal and battles him to get revenge. Sadly, he falls in combat, leaving it up to us to defeat him by ourselves. Unfortunately, Zizan awakens, forcing the battle to an end, and the dragon gives the last of her strength to revive her child. Sadly, Baby is forced to abandon his mother as we retreat from the collapsing castle. This scene... You know, this story is really simple, but this moment really made me feel bad for the little guy, and I imagine it would hit even harder for those who know the pain of losing a loved one. The party flies away from the tower, but get caught in the explosion arising from Zizan's revival, and the ancient evil is shown to us. They do a pretty decent job showing him off, giving him a real feeling of evil and intimidation. I mean, he's just a bunch of squiggly tentacle nonsense, but considering the rest of the game, he really feels like this disturbing embodiment of darkness. He even kind of looks Lovecraftian, reminds me of Nyarlathotep or Shub-Niggurath. We wake up in an ancient city long forgotten by the rest of the world. We're told we need to gather the 4 pieces of holy armor scattered throughout the world, once worn long ago by the legendary hero named Darwin. After a bit of reading at the library, we take Baby to fly around the world, because he can do that now, and venture through 4 dungeons, collecting the holy armor and taking it back to Darkbeat. When he's unable to equip it, we try it on, and it's revealed we are the Chosen One. Now honestly, I really hate the whole Chosen One story trope, and it's pretty telegraphed here because, you know, obvious reasons. I do kind of like how Darkbeat is the one who tells you this though, because he's been going around saying he's the Chosen One. I take it as some kind of delusional motivation to defeat Carmine for the sake of his sister. Really cool how your character model changes when we get the armor, but it does kind of stink how this mythical armor of legend is much less powerful than the platinum gear I bought from Bonnick. Before you can take on Zizan, however, you must have a battle against Darwin to prove your strength as a hero. I really like this boss fight. It's a good way of showing how much you've grown over the course of the adventure. Early in the story, you were losing against Darkbeat and Calcanor, and now not only have you saved both of them, you're taking on the most powerful hero of legend. Although it's really disappointing how he has the same music as any other boss fight. Would have been cool if he had his own theme. Kind of hard to take this spiritual battle of destiny seriously when the same song played when I battled the Mushmare at the start of the game. When you defeat him, he uses his remaining power to send you and Baby off to fight Zizan, being interrupted by Carmine, who's been transformed into a flying centaur. Alright. Fortunately, Darkbeat intervenes and takes care of him while you have this really great scene before the final battle. You fly towards a threatening silhouette of Zizan in the distance as Nahani confesses her love for the hero, asking if they could be together if she was a human girl. The whole time there's this simultaneously uplifting and foreboding song playing in the background called Gliding on Emotions, fading out just as we start the battle with Zizan above the clouds. It's a pretty great final boss fight. The music is intense, the backdrop feels like a fitting set piece, and Zizan genuinely comes across as an intimidating force. Of course, it's a multi-stage fight. The first one states you're dealing no damage and have to use Baby's new Guardian command in order to finish the first stage. Baby takes on a form closer to that of his mother to deal 3 attacks before sealing Zizan with his own power. The second stage has Zizan in this new, freakier form with a trippy background, like the battle is being overtaken by his dark powers. This time you just have to attack him enough so he uses Armageddon, which deals 9,999 damage. At least the name's fitting. With our heroes fallen in battle, Nahani uses the Solomon Ring found earlier in the journey to sacrifice herself and revive the pair, with Knight distraught over the loss of his closest friend, but finding new resolve to complete the battle. Also, pro tip, if you do go after all the living toys like I did and go to sleep in your house to get Peacekeeper, the ultimate living toy, don't use it. Just don't. I wanted to. It doesn't even cost any psychic points to use, but it deals absurd amounts of damage to everything, including yourself. So I accidentally gave Zizan the perfect chance to kill me right after I used Peacemaker and had to replay the first 2 stages. Oops. Just save up Walk Bomb and use it in this one final battle. I only used it once at the start of the game, and this time it dealt 1,300 damage from how much I'd walked. That's pretty cool. Once you defeat Zizan's 3rd form, he disappears in a fiery explosion, and the credits roll as we watch people around the world return to peace as they realize the great evil is now gone forever. We even get to see Darkbeat reunite with his sister after she's returned to... Wait, Bruce Campbell? Didn't know he worked in QA.
Groovy.
By the way, I'm a sucker for when a game thanks you for playing it in the credits. That's really sweet. The final thing we see is Baby visiting Knight in his hometown of Orgo, now living with a much alive and human Nahani as adults. And as I saw this, one thought came to mind. That was really nice. Guardians Crusade is a really nice game. The visuals are cartoony and vibrant with some wonderfully silly designs. The battle system, while being simple at its core, has given a lot of variety thanks to all the living toys you can find. The story, despite sticking to a lot of familiar tropes, is charming, well done, and surprisingly emotional at points. And again, the music is unreasonably good. If you're someone who's played a ton of JRPGs, this isn't going to be anything mind-blowing, but if you are looking for something more laid back to play, or if you're a newcomer trying to get a taste of what to expect from the genre, I think this game is very much worth your time. I'm honestly surprised I never hear about this game when it comes to underrated JRPGs. It's really solid. Is this the best JRPG I've ever played? No, it probably isn't even the best you could find on the PlayStation 1. For what it is though, that being a simplified, cute storybook adventure, I think it's a very fun experience you should consider playing yourself. I'm sure if people played this as a kid, they'd probably really love it. It also helps that it's not a super long game like a lot of other JRPGs. I managed to beat the game in about 19 hours, which is fairly short by the standards of the genre, but I think it's the perfect length for something simpler like this. Alright, that's one game down. Let's see what's next. Ooh, this looks interesting.